Rain came down in a violent, impatient rhythm, as if the sky itself wanted to knock on every locked door in the city. Through the tall windows of Sterling House, sheets of water ran like silver wires, and the great library gathered the storm's noise into a slow, soft percussion. Inside, a man sat in a burgundy velvet chair, his body folded to look asleep, chin tipped, hands resting on the arms, breath even. An envelope lay on the small table within reach, its flap unsealed, and the crisp promise of cash visible through a crease. $5,000, a deliberate temptation, placed there like bait. Arthur Sterling had arranged the room so carefully that every element spoke of control. The fire in the hearth tossed a considerate light across leather spines and framed portraits. The clock on the mantel measured time with a dignified tick. The rug swallowed sound. Arthur's face, when it was spared from shadow, showed the mapped lines of long habit, a lifetime of calculation, an accumulation that had become an armor. He had done this before, left money, watched, judged. He called it a study of character. Others called it a test. In his inward language, it was a routine, a method to confirm what he already suspected about people. Outside, rain pounded. Inside, silence sat like a third person in the room. Arthur let himself appear vulnerable. It was part of the experiment. A feigned nap, a visible prize, a quiet housekeeper who could be observed without their knowing the full script. If a hand reached for the envelope, he would know what people were made of. Trust, in his ledger, was something to be earned and verified, not presumed. On the other side of the estate, Sarah moved like a quiet thread through the servants' corridor. She was not what the photographs in the hallway suggested, a woman of 1,000 manners and small victories, but she carried a weight that no portrait could capture. Sarah was a widow, a housemaid at Sterling House for little more than a month, and she had a son, Leo, 7 years old, whose presence at that moment was a problem she could not fix. The school had closed unexpectedly for the day. Her usual backup, an elderly cousin, was ill. There was no one to leave her boy with. So she had decided, reluctantly, to bring him to work. She had told Mrs. Higgins in a whisper on the landing, while rain made their uniforms cling to their backs. Mrs. Higgins, who had been at Sterling House longer than most of the books on the shelves, had raised an eyebrow and offered a sharp, practical look. "Keep him quiet," she had said. "No one must know." But Sarah's eyes had been too honest to hide the strain. She carried with her the thin jacket for Leo, soaked at the hem. Her hands trembled a little when she smoothed the front of her apron. She thought, not for the first time, of what it would mean if she lost this job, how the small certainties of rent and food would collapse into a night of pleading and impossibly long mornings.
She was careful not to imagine that. Leo trailed behind his mother like a shadow that invited sunlight. He had wide eyes that took things in with a kind of hungry kindness. Damp hair curled into his forehead. His sneakers bore the scuffs of a boy who preferred the street to the drawing room. In his pocket, wrapped in a single square of cloth, was a toy car, a battered little thing, its paint worn smooth by fingers who loved it into life. Leo's father had given it to him before he died. For Leo, that car was not plastic and metal. It was a story and a touch from a man he remembered in pieces and in lullabies. He had been told not to speak unless spoken to, and to stay out of the library. He understood the rules well enough to keep them. Arthur watched them arrive on the corridor camera, not with malice but with a practiced detachment. He discounted many things before they occurred. He discounted the possibility that a child might be honest for its own sake. He discounted that poverty could make people careful stewards of other people's things. He discounted the small acts that did not fit neatly into his ledger. To Arthur, kindness was a hypothesis to be tested, like the weight of a coin, measurable and subject to confirmation. He expected movement toward the envelope. He expected a careful, quick hand, perhaps a furtive glance to see if anyone watched. He expected the practical, not the poetic. What he had not accounted for was how the house quieted around Leo, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. Inside the library, the world seemed paused. The clock on the mantel had its own weathered dignity. Candlelight from a side lamp painted the room in amber. When Sarah saw Arthur's form, her heart tightened. She had thought to set Leo in a corner with a book. She had hoped he would be content with the quiet. But the child drew closer to the fire, where the velvet chair kept its shadow, and the envelope lay within arm's reach. Sarah's breath shortened. "Leo," she whispered, as if the sound might travel across the carpet like a small bird. He stopped, his eyes examining the chair as if it might be a cliff. He hesitated a full measure of time, long enough for Arthur to register it under the softened lids. Arthur's mind, when he allowed it to speak, narrated like a ledger.
Child, temptation, likelihood of theft. He had seen poverty make people clever and desperate. He had seen greed and suits end in the gutters. The idea that a 7-year-old might be stealing for the joy of it was absurd to him. Still, the test was not only to see if the envelope would be taken. It was to see what would happen when temptation met necessity, and whether the presence of a mother, of a vulnerable worker, would change the calculus. Arthur watched, and as he watched, the scenes he expected arranged themselves in his head like chess pieces. Leo's small hand moved, not toward the paper money, but toward the chair.
For a man who had placed his faith in the predictability of human behavior, this was a disruption. A small hand on a velvet armrest, steps that came not as a stealthy thief, but as a child approaching something that was not his. His jacket was too thin for the rain that had followed them in. It had darkened at the sleeves, and his shoulders were bare beneath. His wet shoes made quiet marks on the rug. He stood beside the chair for a moment. Then, very softly, he sat on the edge of it, dragged his jacket closer, and laid it over Arthur's knees. It was a small thing. In ordinary measures, it was a child's instinct: cover someone who appeared cold. In Arthur's room, with his controlled experiment and his ready cynicism, it was an act that had no category. The boy did not fumble for gold. He arranged the jacket as gently as if it were a blanket over a sleeping dog. The lining of the jacket, still damp, brushed the old man's knees. Leo tucked the toy car into his palm, as if holding it against the outside world. Then, with the deliberateness of a child who has been taught to clean up, Leo nudged the envelope with the toe of his shoe until it slid closer to the edge of the table, away from where it might be carelessly taken by accident. He did not press his fingers to the paper. He did not peer at the sum. He was simply, unself-consciously, moving something out of harm's way, a small act of care that had nothing to do with money. He moved back to the corner, to a pile of cushions, and sat cross-legged to watch the fire, as if he had done a good thing and now waited for the world to approve. For a man like Arthur, the scene was intolerably complicated. The running account in him, entries of suspicion typed like a stenographer, stuttered. The experiment had been set to confirm a thesis. Instead, it presented a variable he had not allowed for, a child's sacrificial instinct. What else in his life had he misunderstood because he had been looking for vice and not for virtue? Sarah, who had been dusting the far end of the room where sunlight had been kind, watched with the strained attention of someone balancing on an edge. Her mind was a quick inventory of consequences. If anyone thought her child had tampered with household property, the explanations would be endless, and her job, already fragile, could be at risk. She moved silently toward the doorway to pick him up and lead him away, but her foot caught on a rug, and a small soft sound escaped her that was equal parts surprise and apology. Leo started, looked to her, and then to Arthur's sleeping form. He rose obediently, and with the slow care of someone trained in the manners of small people in big houses, stepped back as if he had been scolded. Arthur, who had been letting the tableau complete itself, felt the interior constriction of a judgment undone. He had expected a hand to take the money. Instead, a child had risked nothing and returned something to safety.
He could not admit to himself that his surprise unsettled him. He would not give himself the luxury of being impressed. He would observe, record, and enact the next phase. He let the pretense continue. When he heard the faint scuff of Mrs. Higgins' shoes and the hurried whisper of Sarah's name, he allowed the rhythm of the household to resume. Sarah moved in, voice low and quick. "Leo, come on," she whispered. Urgency threaded through the syllables. "We need to go. You know the rules." Leo hesitated, hand unconsciously seeking the toy in his pocket. He looked at his mother, and then back at the man who slept, and at the envelope on the table, as if making a quiet, inward calculation about rightness. He did not understand what tests were. He knew what love had been taught to him. He knew, in the simple currency of being 7, that his mother's face was taut with fear. He had seen that look before, the way worry could make a grown woman small. He had a small part to play in holding her upright. Mrs. Higgins's voice, small and tight with experience, urged haste. The scenario could not arouse suspicion. Sarah closed her mouth around a wordless apology and reached for her son. She brushed his hair with fingers that smelled faintly of starch and lemon. "Not here, Leo," she mouthed. "Not now." Arthur listened to their breathing, to the sighs that belonged to those carrying too many questions for one evening. He allowed himself a modest cruelty to the truth he had chosen. He would pretend the chair had been disturbed. He would confront them. He had rehearsed the necessary lines: anger, disappointment, the artist's strokes to make the moral clear in his own ledger. He would say the house had been disrespected. He would demand restitution. It was a clean test. Put pressure on Sarah.
Watch for the plea or the lie. See whether the employees would crumble or show honesty. It was, he told himself, about fairness. He cleared his throat in a way that pretended to be an awakening from a nap. The rustle of the jacket sliding across velvet, the odd pressure of damp fabric against his knees, these things were meant to be part of his revelation. Arthur's eyes opened slowly. He let them linger, letting the room settle into the new reality. His gaze, the wet jacket, Leo standing small and still. "How?" he said, voice flat, as if discovering the movement of his limbs afresh. He let his mouth shape a question that expected deception. "What are you doing with my—" Sarah stepped forward before she could think. Fear sharpened her voice. "Sir, You brought a child into the house?" Arthur's tone was not loud but precise. It served like a scalpel. You could see what he intended to do. Cut open the situation and look for infection. "Do you know how this looks? There is money on the table. There is property here. You could have—" Sarah's face was a map of immediate silent explanations.
She imagined the accusations, the formal notes in the ledger of the house, the whispered meetings in the servants' room. She pictured the cold courtesy of someone who said, "We must let him go," and then the real world in which the family would be one more line on an application. She moved to intercede and knew that argument alone could not save them. Leo, for his part, heard his mother's furtive apology and the danger that shone in her eyes. He took the battered car from his pocket and held it out. Jesus, the gesture of offering something beloved to protect another, is almost a child's instinct. It is unpolished and absolute. Leo's arm was small and not forceful. He said nothing. He simply pushed the toy forward, toward the table, toward the man who had accused them without knowing them. "Take it," Leo said, voice nearly lost in the distance between his courage and the room's grandeur. "This is mine. You can have it. Please." His words were the short and blunt prayers children make when they want the world to be lighter for someone else. Arthur felt something like a cleaving. It was not rhetoric or philosophy. It was a tender, instant recognition of a human calculation that did not compute with his own. There, in a child's smallness, was an exchange he had not costed. Sacrificial giving, not in expectation of return, but as a shield for someone he loved. There was no policy memo that could have prepared him for that. His face, which had been set in the lines of a man who did not need rescue, softened. The anger that had been a mask for the test fell away with a sound like paper tearing. For the first time in a long time, his cynicism could not find its footing. He could have continued the charade, escalated the indictment, driven the point further home, returned to the safety of confirming his prejudice. Instead, he listened to the small, simple note of grief that passed through a mother's lungs and the resounding honesty of a child who did not bargain. Arthur pushed himself up into the chair with careful deliberation. He let them see him fully awake, unguarded now in a way he had never allowed in public. The firelight found the creases at the edges of his eyes and laid them open. He took the toy car from the table with the slow reverence of someone handling a relic. There were no fiscal facts here, only the worn paint and a scrap of cloth tied to its axle like a flag. "What's his name?" Arthur asked, voice made small by something that might have resembled curiosity, or perhaps the first real interest he had had in decades that was not a curiosity about return on investment. "Leo," Sarah said, the word a relief and a plea at once. He's 7. Please, Arthur held the toy up to the light. He turned it between thumb and finger as examining the craftsmanship, though the object offered very little of that. He smiled, and the smile did not quite fit his face. It was more like the cracking of a surface. "This belonged to your father?"
He asked, not because he doubted, but because he wanted permission to believe. Sarah nodded, eyes bright with tears she had not granted permission to fall. "He gave it to him before he passed. It's all Leo has from him." Arthur put the card down on the table beside the envelope, A small and dissonant pairing, sentimental plastic and sterile cash. For a long, tight moment, no one spoke. The rain beat on the windows like a chorus insisting on something undecided. Then Arthur cleared his throat and did the most audacious thing. He stretched the truth like one might stretch a coin between fingers. "You know, I've been running tests," he said. He let his voice carry the irony of confession. "I have set small temptations around this house to see what people would do. It's informative." He let the word hang, as if the confession were an emblem of a man's reason for living. Sarah's expression hardened into a guarded fear. She waited for the conclusion she had rehearsed in 1,000 anxious imaginations, for punishment, for fines, for a humiliating suggestion that she had failed in her duty. She waited for the ledger to be closed against her. Leo's hand curled protectively around himself. The toy car felt suddenly heavier in the gravity of adult attention. He did not understand the social experiment, nor the kind of loneliness that had produced it. He only understood that his mother might be blamed for a thing she had not done, and that he had offered, in the way he knew how, to take some of the cost. Arthur watched their faces and made a decision that was not only about them. He could expose the test, wreak the judgment in a crisp and public way, and close another notch in his confidence that people were small. Or he could let the moment be a revelation to himself, an admission that the world had contours of goodness he had discounted. He chose in that precise breath the less safe route. He dropped the pretense. "I set this up to see what would happen," he said more plainly, "to see who I can trust." His hands, which had long been steady in signing off on business deals and contracts, were suddenly unsteady in front of a child offering a broken toy. "But that does not mean you should lose your job for bringing your son when you had no choice." He could have ended there. He could have allowed his admission to be the final closure. Instead, because the revelation had begun to loosen something in him, Arthur reached into a drawer by the chair and produced a second envelope, smaller, the kind his accountants used for disbursements and bonuses. He slid it across the table. "This should cover today," he said. "And," his voice almost faltered, "and I would like him to come here sometimes. To read. To learn. If you permit it." Sarah's breath hitched. She was not sure she had heard correctly. "Sir." Arthur looked at Leo as if measuring his worth in the only metric he had recently rediscovered, the quality of a small soul under pressure.
"Yes," he said. "Bring him. Let him sit by the fire. I will pay for his schooling." And he added, almost as an afterthought because the weight of old habits could not be shredded in a single act, "I'll see if I can't help with a few practical things. Consider it a test I have failed and can now correct." Mrs. Higgins, who had been watching from the doorway with all the tightness of one whose life had been lived in rooms like this, folded and set her hands. Her mouth was a small, private line. She had seen wealthy patrons of Sterling House perform gestures like this before, grand, easy, and designed to soothe conscience. But what she had not seen was the look in Arthur's eyes now, not charity given with a pat on the head, but a genuine disorientation at having been moved. For Sarah, the envelope and the promise were two different weights. The money could fix the immediate tremor of her life. The promise was dangerous in a different way, bigger, more promising, and thus more terrifying. She did not trust promises because they had emptied out so often around her. She accepted the money, palms shaking, and folded the outer edge with a care that turned the simple act into a prayer. "Thank you, sir," she said, voice small and fierce. Leo, however, did not look at the money. He watched Arthur with the attention of someone who had just performed an act he could not name but knew was important. The toy car lay between them like a currency both poor and infinitely rich. In the corner of the room, the clock ticked on, and the rain softened into a fine mist, the storm beginning to tire itself out. Arthur, who had intended to be the judge, the observer, found himself unprepared for the role of benefactor. He had imagined control, and had instead been offered a way back to feeling something real. He did not yet know what he would do with that feeling. He only knew it had the shape of a crack in the armor he had worn for 50 years. "Bring him tomorrow," Arthur said abruptly, as if to anchor the moment in something practical. "At 3. No one else needs to know." Sarah looked as though someone had offered her an impossible choice wrapped in gentleness. She bowed her head, the movement of someone who had carried shame and was suddenly given a sliver of grace. "We will," she whispered. The episode might have ended there, if the story were content to leave its lesson tidy. But Arthur had been making tests for a long time precisely because he feared being deceived. He believed that behind every act of kindness was an economic calculus. He distrusted motives as if they were currency. The child's offering had undermined his assumptions, and he needed, more than the money or the toy, to know what had happened was an anomaly or a revelation.
So he did something he had not planned. He continued the test. He called Sarah back, and his voice shed whatever formality still remained.
There is damage to the chair, he said, softening the accusation but not removing its weight. A mark. I will need to know if someone was careless. I have to be fair to the house. Sarah's heart lurched. She knew, with the bone-deep recollection of those who live with the threat of dismissal, that this was a crossroads. Admit nothing and be accused, confess and be punished, or try to explain an impossible truth. She looked at her son, who had the kind of face that did not lend itself easily to pleading in legalese. He had offered his treasure. He had done what he could. Now she had to do what was necessary. He didn't do anything to your chair, sir, she said. The words were steadier than she felt. We would never... No, Arthur said before she could finish. He lifted his hand, a gentle command to stop the nervous rehearsal. No more explanations. I wanted to see... His voice paused, and the house took on the hush of someone trying to make sense of their own confession. I wanted to see what people did when the stakes were small and the temptation was obvious. Sarah swallowed. She crouched to Leo, smoothing the damp hair from his forehead with a gesture that was both maternal and practical. We were leaving, she said to Arthur. We came because there was no one else. Arthur looked at her then, and, in the way people do when they are trying on a new garment, tested the fit of a different identity. I see, he said. It was more than a statement. It was a recalibration. He slid his fingers along the arm of the chair where the fabric had become darkened by damp, and then he did something no one expected. He laughed, a small sound like a man who had rediscovered a memory. I suppose I set up a ridiculous scenario to make myself feel less alone in my judgments. You did not fail the test. You... He gestured vaguely at the toy car and the jacket and the mother and son. You passed whatever this was. There was relief and also a new, sharper fear. Sarah did not relax completely. People like her learned early that mercy could be teased apart and marketed in ways that left them with nothing. She accepted the money because immediate needs matter in ways that moral philosophies do not. But when Arthur called for Leo to come sit with him by the fire at 3 the next afternoon, she heard a shape in the offer that could become either a bridge or a new kind of exposure. That night, as rain thinned to a persistent mist, the Sterling house settled into its accustomed rhythms with one notable difference. The presence of a small damp coat on a chair brought a new peculiar warmth. In the servants' quarters, conversation hummed in low tones, some skeptical, some surprised, most quietly curious. Mrs. Higgins muttered about rich men who bought repentance with cash, but she also watched Arthur with a new attentiveness, the kind that notices when a man changes his habits. Arthur, for his part, did not sleep.
He sat in his study, the toy car on the table before him, as if it were a new kind of ledger requiring a different kind of audit. He turned it over. He noticed the tiny chip in the paint and the way the axle had been smoothed by repeated use. He thought of his own childhood, of things given and received that had slipped into the pockets of life like forgotten coins. He had not expected to remember those mornings. He had not expected to feel the hollow ache that a remembered gesture can leave inside a stern man. Outside, the storm moved away, leaving behind a clear sky hung with the aftersmell of rain. Arthur's world, which was usually ordered into columns of cause and effect, had a small area of smudge where predictions no longer fit. He had acted as judge and now found himself wanting to be a teacher. He had not planned to take on responsibility for another human being's future, but he had learned something in the space between the envelope and the toy. That generosity changes the one who gives as much as the one who receives. The idea felt dangerously alive in his chest. Morning arrived with a brittle clarity. The house woke to routines, and the episode of the night before took its place among the infinite small stories of a large home. Yet it remained active, like a pulse beneath the skin. Sarah prepared for the day with hands that moved with practiced economy. Leo kept his toy car wrapped carefully in cloth. He had not been told to practice any special behavior for Arthur's request, and that was what made the meeting the next day all the more honest. He had nothing prepared except the simple habit of being himself. When the hour came and Leo walked back into the library, the room did not belong to the cold, assessing world Arthur had grown so familiar with. There were books, great volumes whose titles proclaimed histories and philosophies,
And there was the old man in the velvet chair, who had, in the space of a night, rewritten his own rules. Leo climbed onto a small stool by the fireplace and opened a picture book with the naive concentration of a child who believed pictures told the truth. Arthur selected other books, ones that had once been mere ornaments to his life, and watched the boy as he read aloud in halting phrases. They spent afternoons that way. Leo learned to pronounce strange words and to ask questions in a tone that was more curiosity than suspicion. Arthur found that he liked to sit and listen, to hear the sound of a voice he had not taught himself to care for. Sarah, at work in the rooms below, would sometimes catch a glimpse of them together, the boy leaning forward, the old man leaning in too, as if both were hearing a similar notice for the first time. It was not a rapid healing. Old habits require long schedules to be altered. But there was a rhythm now. Reading, conversation, a small exchange of practical kindnesses. Yet tests have a way of lingering in one's mind.
Arthur's mind, trained to evaluate, cataloged everything. The softness he felt at the child's gesture frightened him with its unfamiliarity. He kept thinking of the envelope on the table, and the moment when the toy had crossed the space between fear and protection. He kept thinking, too, of what his own will might be upon his death, a sterile piece of paper in a lawyer's hand, which might, in time, be used to justify either generosity or indifference. He did not trust his own motives to be straightforward. So he did something that suited him. He made plans. He employed the same precision he used in business to arrange for Leo's schooling and for Sarah's small but necessary comforts. He did it with an almost clinical efficiency. Letters, payments, enrollment forms. He told himself he was making investments, but the truth was more complicated. The phrase that would have defined his action properly was not return on investment, but a test failed and corrected. Still, old habits return in the way storms revisit a city, suddenly and with familiar noise. Arthur found himself thinking of heirs, his own children who lived at a remove, and whose conversations with him were often punctuated by impatience and calculation. They had always accepted his gifts as both duty and right. He had not intended to change the pattern of inheritance, but the presence of Leo in his afternoons had begun to tilt something inside him. At the same time, the household adjusted. Rumors traveled like small birds through the staff's rooms. People whispered about the old man who had suddenly discovered the pleasures of reading to a child. Some speculated about motives. Others, more generous, felt the warmth of a house where laughter had begun to thread through the corridors. Sarah kept her head low, accepting help but refusing to let it define her. She worried still about dependencies and the fragility of favors. And so the story settled into an uneasy, hopeful rhythm. Arthur returned to his studies with the toy car on his desk. Leo came for afternoons. Sarah worked, watched, and breathed in the relief of immediate shelter. Yet underneath, in the rooms where the house quieted at night, a different kind of inventory was underway. Arthur considered estate plans in the clinical way he had always known how: ledgers, accounts, allocations. But the notion that anything as formal as a will could capture the shift in his heart made him uneasy. He did not believe in miracles, but he believed in the power of a small act to puncture armor. He wanted to do something permanent. He did not yet know what. Weeks turned into months. The seasons moved with their quiet authority. On a sunlit afternoon much later, when the azaleas outside had shaken off their blossoms, and the world felt washed and new, Arthur sat alone in his study looking at the toy car. The room smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish.
He turned the car over in his hands and found, tucked beneath the paint, the memory of a child's offering. It had taken him longer than he would have liked to admit, but he was learning to measure life not solely by accounts, but by moments that could not be priced. He had not planned to become a man who could be rearranged by the small sacrificial gestures of others. He had not planned to let a child's damp coat and a mother's fear crack the shell he had built around himself. Yet here, in the shadowed library, he felt the first stirrings of something that might be called regret for wasted years, and with it, an opening towards something like tenderness. And there, in that opening, lay the real test, one not of others, but of himself. He could continue to be the judge, to arrange trials and measure outcomes, or he could let his life be a different sort of experiment, one in which he tried to be generous because he wanted to be generous, not because he needed to prove a point.
He did not know, still, whether he had the courage for the latter. That decision would not be made in a single moment. It would unfold, tangled and patient. For now, Arthur placed the toy car on the sill beside his favorite lamp, where, in the soft glow, the chipped paint looked less like neglect and more like a history. He added, with a hand that shook only a little, a small card with a neat inscription, a date, and the initials of a boy he had come to know. It was a small promise to himself, a notation on a life planned like a ledger, but now bearing an ink he had not learned to use. The room was silent, except for the clock and the distant sound of a child somewhere in the house. Outside, the sky had cleared. Arthur looked at the toy and felt the beginning of a change he could not yet name. He did not suspect how that change would stretch into years, or how it would alter the lives of those in his house and those far beyond it. He only knew that a test he had designed to confirm his worst suspicions had instead opened his eyes to a different truth, that sometimes the smallest hands give the most costliest gifts. In the days that followed, their interactions settled into a pattern that was at once ordinary and extraordinary. Arthur continued his careful work, managing affairs, reviewing accounts, but now he did so with afternoons punctuated by a small hand opening a book, by questions about horses and planets and words with too many syllables. Sarah watched them from the other side of the household with something like guarded gratitude. She did not mistake the kindness for unconditional safety. She had learned to wear both hope and caution like layers against weather. As those who live inside larger houses watch a clock, so Arthur began to watch the boy, not as a subject of an experiment, but as an apprentice to life. He taught Leo to handle books, to mind the edges of things, and in return he found himself learning, slowly and awkwardly, to handle a human heart.
It was clumsy at first, small missteps, words poorly chosen, but real in a way his accounts rarely were. Still, tests have a long shadow. Arthur had, in his way, an awareness that would not be soothed by mere afternoons of reading. There were choices to be made, legal and practical, about legacies and heirs. He had children who expected a certain order. He had a stock of expectations that governed how things passed after a man like him was gone. This new tenderness complicated everything. It made him wary of his own impulses. He wondered whether he could be trusted to be fair in the end, or whether, in the tangled shoals of affection, he would create new injustices. He had, in a desk drawer, papers that described the distribution of his estate. He kept them as one keeps a map of a city whose streets one no longer walks. He had never imagined Leo's name on those pages, yet the toy car on his sill tugged at his attention in a way that legalities could not. It presented him with a choice he had never believed he would need to face, whether to let his life end on the notes he had always played, or to retune his final measures around the small sacrificial heart that had cracked his armor. What the next months would bring was not yet determined. There were conversations coming that would not be easy. There were relatives who would notice changes. There were practical challenges that required more than sentiment, schooling, guardianship decisions, the curious eyes of a world that likes tidy narratives of inheritance. And there was, in Arthur's chest, a new sort of concern, whether his own inclination toward tests and the illusion of control might yet harm the people he now cared for. On a day when winter reclaimed a taste in the air and the first cold kissed the windows, a letter arrived that required Arthur's attention. It was from a lawyer he trusted to keep details in order, a document that needed signatures and a decision about how the years ahead would be organized. Arthur set the papers on his desk and looked at the toy car beside them as if it could tell him what to do. Leo, who had become accustomed to the rituals of the house and the strange friendship that had formed there, did not yet understand the gravity that hovered in rooms of adults. He understood, in the way children do, the directness of affection. He knew when Arthur smiled at him and when the old man frowned at decisions that weighed heavy. He knew also that some days Arthur would be distant, that the man's history was long and stubborn as old wood. And so, in the library where the rain had once been a drum and the envelope a temptation, life continued with small, luminous gestures. But beneath them, the question that had been sewn into the fabric of the house remained. When the man who had pretended to sleep finally acted for real, what would he leave behind? Who would hold the things he had amassed, and what would he admit were the most valuable among them? The answer would take time. It would require courage in different forms, courage to give, to step away from prejudice, to expand one's own life. It would require a reckoning with those who expected the world to continue as it had always been. For Arthur, it would mean a decision about the shape of his legacy. For Sarah and Leo, it would mean deciding whether to trust a kindness that arrived after fear. On an ordinary evening not long after, as the house readied itself for night, the small, decisive events of that day settled into habit. Arthur continued to keep his ledgers, but evenings were no longer only for numbers. There were now afternoons punctuated by the sound of a child's voice reading aloud from picture books and the crisp turning of pages. Sarah kept working with a steadier step. Leo's damp jacket, once a sign of strain, had become a familiar presence draped over the back of a servant's chair after visits to the library. The toy car rested on Arthur's sill like an emblem, chipped, dirty, and quietly consequential. Time, which had always marched to the clean rhythm of appointments and contracts in Sterling House, grew generous in small ways. Seasons layered themselves across the estate. Leo learned the names of authors and the taste of light on a page. Arthur learned how to pronounce those names and how to sit quietly while a boy practiced the music of reading. They taught one another in the slow, patient way people teach when habits are being rewritten, one sentence, one afternoon at a time. Word of the arrangement moved through rooms below stairs as conversations move in large houses, soft, curious, and often divided. Some staff murmured that the master had taken a fancy. Others suspected an indulgence that would evaporate with the next gust of older habits. Mrs. Higgins watched with the guarded patience of someone who had seen patronage and penance cross similar stages. She would not declare surrender to sentiment, but she allowed herself, once in a while, a small smile when she heard Leo's voice float down the stairwell. Arthur, who had always measured risk and reward with practiced hands, began to measure affection in a different currency. He arranged practical comforts for Sarah, settled unexpected bills, adjusted schedules to ease her burden, and he made sure Leo's schooling was paid for in ways that did not require daily explanations. He handled these things with the same efficient precision he would bring to a balance sheet, but behind that efficiency there was a new discomfort, the knowledge that his motives were not purely rational. He found himself, more and more, thinking about how accounts are settled after death. Old men with fortunes learn to keep their distributions tidy. Their names are arranged like annotations on a ledger. Arthur had children who expected certain patterns in offices to be honored.
He had long rehearsed the language of division and duty, yet the toy car on his windowsill tugged at him in a way that legal documents could not fully account for. It suggested a different set of instructions, ones that had to do with what a life meant to someone else, not what it could hold in bank accounts. Years slid by like pages turned. One decade folded into the next. Leo grew from a careful child into a young man whose gentleness had the quiet authority of conviction. He did not seek to erase what he had been. He kept the humility of a boy who knew where he had come from. Sarah, steadier for the shelter they had found, walked with a quiet confidence born of having been seen and helped without being shamed. Arthur's home, once given to silence and precise order, gained rhythmic warmth. The library, which had been a place of tests, became an ordinary room where questions were asked and answered, and where stubborn old loneliness gradually learned to hold company. The change in Arthur was not without friction. His adult children noticed the afternoons and the investments, and they asked questions in tones polished by entitlement. There were conversations, careful, sharp, about responsibility and legacy. They argued that a man should be able to choose his heirs as he pleased. They also argued that a life's work ought to be preserved for blood. Arthur listened, and for the first time weighed not only the logic, but the moral weight of his decisions. Then, one winter when the cold had come early, Arthur's health began to mark time in a different way. He still read the papers and signed documents, but there were days when his hands needed rest, and nights when he rose slowly from his chair. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had long conducted the machinery of his life, that the accounting would soon need to be settled. The papers in the drawer were no longer theoretical. They required ink and witness. Arthur called his lawyer, Mr. Henderson, and then his children. There were polite visits, dutiful conversations. There were attempts at reassurance that his routine would be honored. But the decisions that kept him awake had less to do with distribution than with the question that had first unsettled him in the library. What exactly should be counted as the truest legacy? His own name on buildings? A neat allocation of shares? Or the memory of a small act that had undone his certainty and made him feel again? He did what he had always done best. He put his thoughts into writing. There, in the margins of the legal language, he allowed himself a frankness he had not permitted before. He composed a letter to be read at his death, a simple, unostentatious explanation that would not plead, but would declare.
He wrote of the night with the envelope and the damp jacket and the toy car. He wrote of the crack that opened in him and the slow work of repairing the pieces.
He wrote, plainly, that little hands had taught him more than 100 ledgers ever had. When Arthur died, quietly, in his own bed in a morning that smelled faintly of lemon and old paper, Sterling House felt the loss like the shifting of furniture. Staff moved with a tenderness reserved for places where a life had been lived with complexity. His children,